Hi, everyone, and welcome to Cherry Bekaert's GovCon podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. My name is Curt Smith. I'm a manager in Cherry Bekaert's Government Contractor Services Group, and with me today is Brendan Halloran, also a member of Cherry Bekaert's Government Contractor Services Group. Brendan is a senior manager in the group and a former Divisional Administrative Contracting Officer with DCMA. He was with DCMA for 10 years. And today we are taking a look at idle facilities. So thanks for joining us. And on the subject of idle facilities, Brendan, generally speaking, I mean, these idle facilities can take various forms. For example, when I was with DCAA, I audited shipyard, which is a manufacturing facility, and idle facilities in that context would mean there is, say, a dry dock available for overhaul of a destroyer or a naval ship of some kind, and the Navy has not awarded a contract for an overhaul, and that facility sits idle. There is some incentive for the government to keep a manufacturing facility that is of national concern, if you will, like one that builds destroyers, aircraft carriers, submarines, what have you, to the defense industrial base. Anyway, it's very important for the government to keep those yards occupied with ongoing contracts. That's one type of idle facility. Another one is more topical, if you will, given the pandemic, and that is idle Class A office space, which is suddenly an issue with the pandemic, given that everyone, with the onset of the pandemic, was basically made to work from home. That's in the private sector and the public sector, with government contracts and, of course, non-government contracts. So there's an issue around the country, perhaps around the world, where Class A office space is sitting unused, where you might have 30 or 40 people coming into the office. Those same people are allowed to work from home. Shall we say, businesses generally speaking, management has become more comfortable with employees working from home. They trust that the employees are working and that the quality of the work is the same as if the employee were working at the office. So this has become accepted. So there's no impetus or need for employees to report to the office in most cases, if you will. So this creates an issue with idle facilities. Contractors may have taken out a 5 to 10 year lease on some Class A space, and prior to the pandemic, that space was fully occupied. With the onset of the pandemic and currently, that space is maybe 25% occupied. So the contractors find themselves in a position of paying for unused space. So how does the government view that? And what I thought we'd do is take a look at the cost principles first, and then I was going to get your insight and perspective on this, because I think you bumped into this before. Matter of fact, I know you have. So let me bring up the appropriate cost principle. This is FAR 31-205-17. And there is actually a time frame referenced in that cost principle of a year. So the idle capacity, and I'm reading from the principle, means the unused capacity of partially used facilities. And in 31-205-17 B2, there is the time frame of a year referenced, where the government is basically willing to give contractors a year to find other uses for that space, or to reduce the cost for that space. So you and I discussed earlier the current environment for perhaps subleasing that space is a far more difficult one today, given the fact that there aren't as many people seeking space. I mean, with all this unused Class A space, there aren't a lot of people looking for new space. Okay, they've got plenty of space on their hands already under lease. So if a contractor finds himself in this situation, Brendan, what would be your response initially?
Yeah, thanks, Curt. It's definitely, it's always been a topic of debate with contractors and the government, and certainly I think the reason why we decided to talk about this today is, in the COVID environment, it really has greatly changed what the occupancy is and the really perceived need for employees to actually be at the workspace. And so there's a number of kind of areas, and one I just want to drill down a little bit. In the principle for it is that the distinction between idle facilities and idle capacity, is that an idle facility, theoretically would be completely unused. There's no employees regularly reporting. There's no operations going on there. Idle capacity is a little bit more vague in that it's a portion of, in this case, a facility as an example that, is, perhaps, used at a reduced level. Perhaps it's got, 20% of, if we're talking about employees being the, kind of the capacity, 20% of, 100. And so, there's a little bit more kind of room for interpretation on capacity because, that lends itself to, at what point, does a, facility or an office that, has greatly reduced, occupancy, at what point, should the business or the contractor be thinking about, reducing its footprint or consolidating those particular employees perhaps to another building or facility, or, in this day and age, it could be to remote. So there's, a couple of areas where, if you're subject to government review or audit, in terms of what the usage is, and that, idle facility, if you're really not utilizing that, as you mentioned, Curt, that, the prescribed approach to that is that, a reasonable amount of time, usually not to exceed 1 year. And so contractors really do need to be aware of this and thinking about it. I do believe that, kind of in with the COVID pandemic, I think that everyone, including the government, is in a similar situation with, a shift to remote work and uncertainty as to when or if, you're going to get back to that office environment. And so contractors would certainly be best, you know, to be planning and evaluating exactly, what their facility footprint is, what the usage is, what the outlook is, and by really kind of being proactive in that approach, it really kind of starts to demonstrate that you're aware of it. You acknowledge that there may be some unused capacity or perhaps even a completely idle facility, and by really starting to document what the plans are for that, what the options are for that. In some cases, if you had perhaps a idle facility, what are some of the things that you would look at? Would include, is there a future contract need for it? What was the original contractor program need to have that space? And really documenting and demonstrating that you've got all of those points met is very important to kind of support the case for one. Obviously the space was, there was a requirement for it originally, and what is the forward-looking need for it. And if there really is none, you need to start to document things like, what actions are you going to take to, dispose of the space? Is it a matter of subletting? Is there an option to terminate the lease? And what are the costs associated with that? Those are the types of things that, if there is a question or a finding in an audit related to that space or facility, you really do need to have some justification as to, what were you, actively doing to address it, and to support, either the costs associated with it for that up to 1 year period. And in some cases it does, some contractors run into situations where they can't dispose of that space in over a year. So there's a lot of factors that that need to be considered, and really actions that can be taken to kind of demonstrate that to the government.
So in your experience, which I found refreshing, again, I was on the audit side and you're on the contracting office side. I found refreshing is that the government's open to negotiation. In other words, for example, you mentioned to me that the government may be willing to pay for termination costs for a lease. And your comments just now about documenting efforts to sublease the space, to find other uses for the space, to win follow-on contracts or other contracts where that space could be used by that program. All these things come into play in the decision of the government to pay that claim, perhaps past that year. I know the year is not written in stone, but just using that as sort of the basic parameter, to pay the cost of that space past a year, if you will. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I've certainly seen circumstances such as that. And again, from an audit perspective, the year will, from my experience, always be the kind of the cutoff. So, anything in excess or any cost associated with that facility or space in excess of a year would certainly likely end up as a question costs or finding. And so circumstances that might contribute to the consideration of perhaps a contracting officer of any any time and the associated costs in excess of that year, things like what were the initial requirements, were there special requirements for that space, and that could be whether it be something unique about the building, access, could be security requirements associated with a contract. And so some of those things that drove the initial need or contract requirement, should be documented and really used as part of the support case for, perhaps why it's not as easy to find, a way to sublet it, or perhaps there's not as great of a demand for that type of space or, for its unique, attributes. So there's definitely things that can be, really proposed to the government to support some circumstances. Again, it may be rare, but there are instances where, consideration can be given greater than that year. Again, you want to make every effort to, to not exceed that kind of general rule of thumb, but by being proactive in terms of, understanding what the need was and the time, the lease that was associated with it, if that were the case, and really those details could be used to support, further consideration of reasonability on it.
So, has the government, we both, as GovCon professionals, are constantly on the lookout for the release of guidance, generally speaking, and in particular about certain issues. Have you seen any guidance released from the government? I know that, as you mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, the government itself is probably struggling with the same issue. So it's not like the government is unaware of it. And I'm sure contractors have complained to the government already somewhere, in the network of contracting officers across the country. So have you seen anything?
No, I haven't. And, I certainly have, talked with a number of folks, and just to see if there's any, active discussion happening, perhaps in, regulatory agencies or audit agencies, or, even more so, is there any actual guidance coming out? And there really isn't anything firm at this point. And so, I think, as we've discussed, is that, I think everyone, including the government, as well as contractors, are in the same boat of, it's very uncertain in terms of, what would the environment need to be and when will that be, for things to potentially go back to normal, and normal being what was pre-COVID in terms of occupancy. And there's just so much uncertainty there, so we don't know when that clock would start, from, let's say, an audit perspective. So that's why I think it's good for for companies and contractors to be thinking about it now, in terms of what planning can you do, and what do you really see as a realistic occupancy or use of some of their space, and are there benefits to consolidating, or perhaps looking for a way to dispose of some of it.
Right. I think you mentioned something along the line of a conversation with one of your contacts, that in forward pricing proposals, the idea of consolidating space is being brought up, if you will.
Well, no, I think it's a good point, in that certainly contractors who are able to who have identified that a certain part of their workforce are going to be either only remote or predominantly remote, or they're going to use some kind of hoteling. Obviously their footprint can be reduced, and do they have the ability to consolidate to some of their other existing facilities? And by consolidate, I mean move some of those employees or operations, and really reduce what that footprint is. And so there's certainly benefit to that, if there are ways to either dispose or use the space otherwise. But there's certainly benefits of that in terms of reduced or potential reduced costs associated with the facilities. So in forward pricing rates, and in what you're looking at for your budget and forecast, there's certainly opportunity there that contractors should be aware that they can consider that when they're looking at next year or years beyond that. So there's certainly costs that can affect their rates, and certainly it could be a competitive win. There's certainly some strategies that could be used while you're actually thinking about what the resources and facilities needed are.
Yeah, one other thing that you mentioned, and we'll bring this conversation to a close here shortly, but is the fact that during the onset of the pandemic, certain government employees, not government employees, contractor employees, were not allowed to report to work at all. And so that, in my mind, if that were true, that would extend that year parameter beyond, give some consideration to extend that time frame. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Curt. And I think, I think that's why there hasn't been any firm directive or guidance in terms of, when is audit going to be looking at this. Obviously, it'd be very hard to, have, question costs or audit findings associated with facilities at this point, because literally, aside from, very, select, operations where people really do have to show up every day, pretty much the entire contractor base has been in the same situation. So I do believe that there would have to be consideration given to timing, and when is the time right to actually look at this in terms of what time frame can we associate with it being reasonable to continue occupying, or at least having the costs associated with some of these facilities. So I think it's a bit of an unknown, and I certainly do know that at some point it will be picked up again. And so contractors being prepared with with what their plan is probably the best course of action.
I agree, and I agree also that it's a very much a wait and see situation. Everybody, as you said, is in the same boat. And we'll, 3 or 4 to 6 months from now, the picture could look very different. And maybe we can revisit this topic again, and maybe introduce someone from our real estate industrial group to comment on this, because I'm sure some of their clients are the landlords that are seeing this change in their circumstances and its effect on their businesses. So I want to thank you for your time today, Brendan. You have been very informed. Your comments are very informative, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah,
And
great
with
talk.
that, we'll sign off. If you have any questions, generally speaking, please email us. And you can find this and future podcasts on our website at cbh.com. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks, Curt.